top Kubernetes commands you need to master. Welcome to this audiobook, where we'll dive into the top Kubernetes commands that are essential for managing your cluster efficiently. Whether you're deploying applications, scaling workloads, or troubleshooting issues, these commands will be your go-to tools in your Kubernetes toolkit. So, let's get started. Kubectl get, the command to view everything. Our first command is probably the most commonly used. Kubectl get. This command lets you retrieve information about any resource in your cluster. Let's say you want to list all your pods. You'd run kubectl get pods. Need a list of your nodes? Just run kubectl get nodes. This command is your gateway to view what's happening in your cluster. You can add options like O wide for more detailed output, or A to list resources across all namespaces. Kubectl describe, dive into details. Next, we have Kubectl describe. This is your tool to get a deep dive into the details of any Kubernetes resource. It gives you more granular information, like events or the conditions of a pod, making it great for troubleshooting. For example, if a pod isn't working, you can describe it like this. Kubectl describe pod name. And you'll get everything from container logs to recent events. It's a powerful way to get a behind-the-scenes look. Kubectl apply, create or update resources. Moving on, we have Kubectl apply. This command is used to create or update resources using YAML configuration files. It's one of the most important commands for deploying applications in Kubernetes. Let's say you have a YAML file for a deployment. You'd apply it like this. Kubectl apply ffile.yaml. If you've made updates to the file, you can simply reapply it with the same command. Kubernetes will handle the changes for you. Kubectl create, start new resources quickly. When you want to create a resource from scratch, use Kubectl create. It's a faster, more imperative way to create resources, without needing a YAML file. For instance, if you want to create a deployment, you can run Kubectl create deployment name image equals image. Or, create a simple service like this. Kubectl create service cluster app name TCP equals 80:80. This command is great for quick tasks when you don't need full YAML files. Kubectl delete, clean up resources. Now, after creating resources, you'll often need to clean things up. That's where Kubectl delete comes in. It does exactly what it sounds like. It removes resources from the cluster. To delete a pod, you can run Kubectl delete pod name. You can delete any resource, whether it's deployments, services, or even entire namespaces. Kubectl logs, inspect pod logs. When things go wrong, the first thing you'll often want to check are the logs. Kubectl logs gives you direct access to the logs of a running container. For example, Kubectl logs pod name. If your pod has multiple containers, you can specify which one with Kubectl logs pod name C container name. To follow the logs as they update, use the F flag, just like you would with tailf. Kubectl exec, run commands inside containers. Next up is Kubectl exec, which allows you to run commands inside a running container. This is especially helpful for debugging or interacting with running applications. To run a command inside a container. Kubectl exec pod name, command. Want to open a shell inside the container? Use Kubectl exec it pod name, /bin/bash. It's like shing into your container. Kubectl scale, adjust the number of pod replicas. When you need to scale your application up or down, use Kubectl scale. This command allows you to change the number of pod replicas running in a deployment or replica set. For example, to scale a deployment to 5 replicas, you would run Kubectl scale deployment name replicas equals 5. With this simple command, you can adjust capacity on the fly. Kubectl rollout, manage deployment rollouts. For managing deployments, Kubectl rollout is a key command. You can use it to check the status of a deployment, pause or resume a rollout, or even roll back to a previous version. For instance, to check the status of a deployment rollout, Kubectl rollout status deployment/deployment name. And if something goes wrong, you can roll back to the previous version with Kubectl rollout undo deployment/deployment name. Kubectl get events, view cluster events. To monitor what's happening in your cluster, use Kubectl get events. This command shows you recent events and gives you a sense of what Kubernetes is doing behind the scenes. For example, Kubectl get events sort by equals.metadata.creation timestamp. This sorts the events by time, so you can see what happened most recently. Kubectl port forward, access applications locally. Sometimes you need to test a pod locally without exposing it to the internet. That's where Kubectl port forward comes in. It lets you forward a local port to a pod running in the cluster. For instance, kubectl port forward pod/pod name 8080 to 80. This command forwards port 8080 on your local machine to port 80 on the pod, allowing you to access it directly in your browser. Kubectl top, monitor resource usage. Resource usage is crucial for understanding how your applications are performing. Kubectl top helps you see the CPU and memory usage of nodes and pods. For example, to view resource usage for nodes, kubectl top nodes, or for pods, kubectl top pods. This gives you a quick look at the health of your cluster in terms of resource consumption. Kubectl CP, copy files between local and pods. Sometimes you need to copy files between your local machine and a running container. Kubectl CP lets you do just that, to copy a file from your local machine to a pod. Kubectl CP local path pod name container path. And to copy a file from a pod to your local machine. Kubectl CP pod name container path local path. This is handy for transferring logs or configuration files. Kubectl config, manage cluster access. Managing different Kubernetes clusters? Kubectl config helps you configure and switch between different clusters and contexts. For example, kubectl config current context. This command shows your current active context. You can switch contexts with kubectl config use context name. You can also list all available contexts using kubectl config get contexts. Kubectl edit, modify resources on the fly. This command allows you to directly edit live resources in your cluster using your preferred text editor. It's useful when you want to make quick changes without modifying YAML files manually. For example, kubectl edit deployment name. This will open the deployment in your editor, where you can make changes that will take effect immediately. View kubeconfig. To view your environment's kubeconfig, run the following command. Kubectl config view. The command returns a list of all clusters for which kubeconfig entries have been generated. View the current context for kubectl. The current context is the cluster that is currently the default for kubectl. For example, kubectl config current context. Run individual kubectl commands against a specific cluster. You can run individual kubectl commands against a specific cluster by using cluster equals cluster unders. For instance, consider an environment with two clusters, my cluster 1 and my cluster 2, in which the current context is my cluster 1. You want to deploy an application to my cluster 2, but you don't want to change the current context. To deploy the application to my cluster 2 without changing the current context, you should run the following command. Kubectl run my app image just docker.pkg.dev/my project/my repo/my app 1.0 cluster my cluster 2. Conclusion. Your essential Kubernetes toolkit. These commands form the core toolkit for interacting with Kubernetes. Whether you're listing resources, troubleshooting issues, or deploying applications, mastering these commands will make you a more efficient Kubernetes user. In the next chapter, we'll explore some advanced tips and tricks to further streamline your Kubernetes workflows.